advice on parasite control is not always straightforward, and there's not always, and often there is not a single parameter and threshold that you can use to advise treatment or no treatment. So that makes it difficult to get the message across to the farmers and the veterinarians, and to make them apply sustainable worm control. And that's what we observed in the last 20, 30 years when we were working on sustainable worm control and advising sustainable worm control practices to farmers, that many farmers just didn't take up the message. And that's why we started to work with some communication scientists, Lieslot Hutters and Verlin Kouberge from Ghent University, to investigate and to study farmer behavior in the context of sustainable worm control practices. And this work that I will present is mainly the work of Fiona van der Velde, the first author, who you can see, who is a social scientist in our lab. I'll try to. Okay, so a little bit of background. Most of it has been given by Johannes. So anthelmintic resistance is now emerging in cattle, not just in the EU, but basically worldwide. So we need to adjust our use of anthelmintics and use them wisely, more sustainably, to mitigate the development of anthelmintic resistance. And these can be targeted treatments or targeted selective treatments, but also alternative worm control measures are an option, and they can be combined, which would be then integrated parasite control. There are a lot of efforts, such as COWS, for example. It's a platform in the UK to advise farmers and to promote the use of sustainable worm control by farmers. There's also SCOPS in the UK for smaller ruminants, for example, but still uptake of sustainable worm control measures is kind of limited. So we wanted to do something about that. And the first step is to understand what drives farmers to adopt or to not adopt sustainable worm control practices. So which are the incentives and the barriers for farmers to adopt sustainable worm control practices? And to do so, we try to integrate behavior psychology with veterinary parasitology and a touch of preventive veterinary medicine in a kind of an overlapping discipline, trying to understand farmers' behavior. We started with building a model, and that model was founded in or based on some psychological theories like the health belief model and the theory of planned behavior. And this model investigates some factors. I'm using my arrow, but I now realize you can't see it. The model you can see on the right of the slide. So we investigated some factors that might or might not have an influence on the farmer's intention to. Oh, I see an arrow appearing now. Is that something I can? Oh, can you see my arrow now?
Yes. Did you activate the arrow?
We can see.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect.
Okay, great.
Perfect. So we wanted to investigate different factors that could have an influence, an effect on the intention of farmers to use diagnostics to inform treatment decisions, just as an example of sustainable worm control. And based on the health belief model, these are the dotted lines, or the theory of planned behavior, which is represented by the full arrows, we put some factors in the model, such as risk perception by the farmer, the risk of development of anthelmintic resistance. So what's the perceived susceptibility of the farmer for their farm to have problems with anthelmintic resistance, and how do they perceive the potential severity of anthelmintic resistance on their farm, and then how would that influence their intention to use a more sustainable worm control? What's the effect of their attitude towards anthelmintics and their attitude towards diagnostics on their behavior intention? What's the effect of subjective norms? Subjective norms being their perception of the expectations of important people in their life on their behavior. And these important people in their life can be their peer farmers, it can be the veterinarian, it can be family members. Finally, perceived control is the perception of the farmers on their ability to apply sustainable worm control practices. To validate this model, we used two different approaches. A quantitative approach, which means we did a questionnaire survey. And the advantage of a questionnaire survey in a quantitative approach is that you can validate this model statistically because you have quantitative data and you can analyze whether or not these factors have a significant positive or negative effect on the farmer's behavior intention. But ideally, this should be accompanied or complemented by qualitative research, being focus group meetings or interviews with the farmers, because from the qualitative research, additional information can be gained that complements the model, but I'll come to that later. So we developed a questionnaire. We sent it to nearly 2,000 dairy farmers in northern Belgium. It was quite a good response, 29% response, which was nearly 600 farmers who completed the questionnaire. The questionnaire, so you have the behavior intention, in our case, uptake of diagnostics to inform anthelmintic treatment. You have the factors that might or might not influence this behavior intention. And for each of these factors, we had 3 different questions in the model. Questions are called items. And these items were constructed as either a 7-point bipolar scale or as a 7-point Likert scale, which are very similar types of questions probing for attitude and behavior intention in the farmers. Then the effect of these factors measured by the items, by the questions, was analyzed using structural equation modeling, which is a specific type of analysis for these models. And the questions that this analysis answers is, does the model fit the data, which obviously is important? Do the questions measure the corresponding factor? Some questions or items had to be deleted because according to them, the analysis, they didn't, and whether or not some of the factors correlate, which is important for the interpretation. This is the result of the model, which was published by Fiona van der Velde, and it appeared that in our dairy farmer population in northern Belgium, the risk for anthelmintic resistance, their perception of the susceptibility of their farm for anthelmintic resistance and the severity of anthelmintic resistance on their farm had no significant effect on their intention to use diagnostics or sustainable worm control, which is understandable in a way because certainly at that time, 10 years ago, anthelmintic resistance was only just emerging in cattle, so most cattle farmers were not really worried about it and didn't consider anthelmintic resistance when thinking about applying sustainable worm control practices. The farmers' attitude towards anthelmintics had a significant negative effect on their intention to use sustainable worm control, which is not surprising. The more favorable the farmers' attitude towards anthelmintics, the more likely they are going to continue using anthelmintics without considering an alternative. In contrast, their attitude towards diagnostics, again, not surprisingly, had a significant positive effect on their intention to use diagnostics. Also, the subjective norms, their perception of the opinion of other people in their life had a significant positive effect on their adoption intention, as did their perceived control. These are the results in a nutshell, but there are some gaps or disadvantages in this approach. The first one is that a quantitative approach using a model and structural equation modeling, although it has the advantage of being quantitative and allowing a statistical analysis, it only measures the effect of these factors on the intention of the farmer to use sustainable worm control, not on the actual behavior. And the difference between their intention to behave and their actual behavior is well known in social sciences as the intention-behavior gap, which was not addressed by this model. And then even if a farmer performs the desired behavior, such as the use of sustainable worm control measures, you're not even sure that they will keep doing so in the next year. So maintenance of behavior is also very important, but it's not considered in the model. Moreover, even though we have now results on which factors have a significant effect on the farmer's intention to adopt diagnostics, we don't know why. We don't know the underlying beliefs. And for example, considering the opinion of others, we don't know which are the significant others. Is it the vet? Is it the farmer's mother-in-law? Is it the neighbor? Is it peer farmers? We have no idea about that. And that's why that's where the qualitative research comes in. So that's the second part of the research, the qualitative research. And we didn't use focus groups, which would have been a possibility, but we chose to do in-depth interviews with farmers, semi-structured interviews in 2 periods of the year. We interviewed, or Fiona interviewed, 19 dairy farmers. It seems an odd number. The reason for this number is that you start selecting a handful of farmers where you perform the interviews, and then by snowball effect, you can then identify other farmers that have been suggested by the first group, and then you go on with your interviews until you start noticing saturation of the answers. If you start noticing that, oh, I've heard this story before, and the answer, and you can almost predict the answers of the farmer, that it means that you have reached saturation and that performing additional interviews has no added value more. So that's why we stopped at 19 interviews. Then all these interviews were recorded and transcribed, which is quite a lot of work. And in the transcription, keywords and key items are then identified using specific software and Vivo. And then the results of these interviews gave some interesting insights. First of all, about the topic. Something we suspected before, but was confirmed by the interviews, is that parasitic infections are not on the top of the farmers' minds. It's not their primary, well, it's not their priority, and there's different reasons for that. First of all, GI nematodes, which was the topic of this study, don't produce spectacular outbreaks like some viral diseases do. They stay more or less under the radar. And also there are other diseases the farmers are more preoccupied with, for example, because of regulations. Now, for example, in Belgium, IBR is on the top of the mind of the farmers because there's a new legislation and new regulations about this disease. Also, outbreaks, for example, I can imagine that in France, lumpy skin disease is a priority in some areas rather than GI nematodes. So this is already bad news, because if the disease is not a priority in the farmer's mind, it might be more difficult to convince the farmer to change their behavior for the control of these diseases. Coming back to this perceived susceptibility and perceived severity of anthelmintic resistance, that had no significant effect in the model on the farmer's behavior intention. There are several reasons that came out of the interviews. Lack of knowledge of anthelmintic resistance, which was surprising for us, because we assumed that anthelmintic resistance was a widely known concept. But apparently it wasn't. We even notice, and we still notice when we visit farms, that sometimes farmers mix up anthelmintic resistance and immunity of the animals. Resistance for farmers, immunity of the animal is also resistance, and they sometimes mix up these things. Also, some of the farmers we interviewed had an aversion of the word resistance because they have been blamed for antibiotic resistance for decades now, and they're just fed up with stories about resistance. And lastly, another reason why risk perception was not an important factor in the model was that they have the impression that they have worm infections under control, that there is no urgent problem. So although anthelmintic resistance development may be a future problem, at present it's not, so they are happy with the situation as it is. About the negative effects of the farmers' attitude towards anthelmintics on their adoption intention and the positive effect of their attitude towards diagnostics. Although, of course, the effects per se were quite predictable, the interesting thing is why they or what's below, what's in the farmers' minds, farmers that have a positive attitude towards anthelmintics, it's mainly for economic reasons. They like anthelmintics because it's a quick and easy method to improve productivity. So it's a very rational attitude towards anthelmintics. While the farmers who had a positive attitude towards diagnostics, it was not based on economic motives or rational motives. It was more a moral thing. Like they liked diagnostics because they wanted to how you say that, to advertise themselves as more sustainable and more I can't think of the word now, responsible farmers. So they wanted to be an example for other farmers. So it's a completely different mindset that's below the attitude towards diagnostics than the mindset that supports or underlies their attitude towards anthelmintics, which may seem trivial, but it can be important if you want to use communication messages to change their attitude towards anthelmintics or diagnostics. Then the subjective norms. Who were the people that, in the farmer's mind, in their perception, would have a big influence on their intention to use sustainable worm control? Not surprisingly, the veterinarian came out as a very important factor. So according to the interviews, the veterinarians have a very important influence on the farmer's intention to use sustainable worm control. Surprisingly, other farmers didn't. So according to the interviewed farmers, they didn't care about the opinion of their peer farmers to decide on parasite control measures. So in their perception, they were independent farmers, and we don't care what other farmers do. We do our own thing because we know better. And that was something that we were a bit surprised about. Perceived control as a factor positively influencing adoption intention was also a bit predictable. When a tool, a sustainable parasite control tool, would be practical and flexible, then farmers would be positively influenced to use that tool in worm control. Surprising results came when we addressed the intention behavior gap. So we know that farmers' intention to use sustainable worm control doesn't always lead to actual application of sustainable worm control practices. And surprisingly, when it comes to actual use of diagnostics and sustainable worm control, in contrast to what they said before in the interviews, the peer farmers became a positive reference group. So when it comes to their intention to behave, they say, oh, we don't care about the opinion of our peer farmers, we do our own thing. But in reality, when it comes to actual behavior, they do follow the group. And this also is an example of the importance of the qualitative research to complement the model, because according to the model, where you only look at adoption intention, the farmers would not be an important factor. Another thing that came out of the interviews to address the intention behavior gap is habit. Habits are very important in farmer behavior, and if they have a habit of strategic deworming, for example, which is not a sustainable worm control measure, then it's very difficult to overcome that. So breaking habits will be very important in changing farmer behavior. And then, surprisingly, the veterinarian. So as I told you a minute ago, the veterinarians were identified as very important factors influencing the farmer's intention to use sustainable worm control. However, when it comes to actual application of sustainable worm control, the veterinarian all of a sudden became more of a barrier, because farmers started to hide behind the veterinarian and shifting responsibility from their own to the veterinarian. So yeah, I had an intention to use sustainable worm control, but my farmer didn't support it, or my farmer didn't advise me on sustainable worm control. My veterinarian, excuse me, my veterinarian didn't advise me on sustainable worm control, or my veterinarian wasn't really enthusiastic about it. So finally, I didn't do it. So while there's a dual attitude of the farmer considering their veterinarian. So veterinarians have a positive effect on adoption intention, behavior intention, but can be used as an excuse to finally not apply this sustainable worm control. As I said before, behavior of farmers is a dynamic process. It's not because they apply sustainable worm control this year that they will do next year. So habits are important, an important factor in maintenance of behavior. Excuse me. And to break, excuse me, to break those habits, planning is important. So we figured out from the interviews that if you want farmers to apply sustainable worm control practices, make sure that together with the vet, you plan it in their agenda. If it's planned, you have a much bigger chance that they will really apply it. If it's not planned and if it's just a vague intention, then very often the habits of the farmer will be maintained rather than the new sustainable worm control practices. So this is the final model that we then adopted from both the quantitative and the qualitative research. I'm not going to repeat all the things that are in the slide because it's a kind of summary basically from what I said before. But then we within COMBAR already mentioned by Johannes was a cost action. So we had participants from all over Europe on combating anthelmintic resistance. And within this cost action, this framework, we took the opportunity to ask the question, okay, we had results now from our quantitative and qualitative research in Flanders, but can you extrapolate those results to farmers in other countries in Europe? How conservative are those results? And that's why we did the quantitative research in a number of countries. And it was done both in cattle farmers, that's where we were involved. It was also done in sheep farmers, and that was organized by our colleagues in the Morden Research Institute. I realize that involuntarily I'm changing the size of the slides. You can see that a number of countries participated. In some countries, we had a good response on the questionnaire survey. In other countries, the response was low, which resulted in the fact that we could only use the results of a limited number of countries. This slide just tells you that it's very important if you want to extrapolate a study like this to different countries, that the questionnaire surveys are identical. So we used the original source survey, translated it in the local languages by one particular person, then it was back translated into English by a second person, by a different person. Then this back translated survey was compared with the original in English, and if there were differences, they were adapted. If there were no differences, then the translated survey was used in the respective countries. And I'll show you the results of the countries where we did have sufficient results to build and validate the model. We had good participation in Norway, and I'm not going into the details of the model, but basically the bottom line is that the model was very similar to the results that we obtained in Flanders. So it appeared that factors that had an influence on farmer behavior in Flanders, northern Belgium, that these factors were similar in Norway. And because we had sufficient participants in Norway, we could even include behavior rather than just behavior intention in the model. And again, routine came out as a significant, so habits as a significant negative factor. Subjective norms again were a significant positive factor. I'm not going to repeat all the results, but basically the results were very similar to the results we had in Belgium. For Germany and Austria, we did not have sufficient respondents to build and validate separate models, but the results of those two countries with relatively similar dairy cattle operations were merged into a single model. And again, the model yielded similar results as the model we had in Belgium. In Italy, also a good response to the questionnaire, the results were different. For example, risk severity, so the farmer's perception of the risk for development of anthelmintic resistance, the severity of anthelmintic resistance on their farms did have a significant effect on their intention to use sustainable worm control practices, which was not the case in the other models, more in Northern Europe. We don't know exactly what's the reason for the differences. It can be that in Southern Europe, farmers have a different mindset and their behavior is influenced by, in terms of parasite control, is influenced by different factors compared to Northern Europe. That's a possibility. But since we only had one country in Southern Europe, we cannot support that hypothesis. Another potential reason might be small differences in the experimental design and the execution of the study. I'm not going into detail there. So basically, we are not sure that the factors that influence farmers in Western Europe will also be useful in Southern Europe. So that's the same conclusion here. Limitations of this European study was that some countries were excluded because they had insufficient data. In some countries, it's very difficult to get responses from cattle farmers on questionnaire surveys, and therefore we don't have a complete image of the drivers and barriers for European dairy farmers' adoption of sustainable worm control. Also, a statistical comparison between the different countries is impossible because there were slight difference in survey data collection and because the number of countries was too low. So this is the first part of our work. Which factors have a positive or a negative effect on farmers' adoption of sustainable worm control practices or on farmers' intention to adopt sustainable worm control practices. But then, basically, this is just a model. And a model is only, it gives an indication. We cannot assume that everything that comes out of a model is really true. So ideally, different factors that had a significant positive or negative effect in the model on farmer behavior intention should be tested with interventional experiments in the field. We did that to a certain extent. Oh, sorry, I don't mean to move the size of the slides. The first experiment, for time reasons, I will skip. I will go to the second experiment. And in this experiment, what we did is to test two things. If we send a message to the farmer, so we really send in experiments like this, we send a communication to farmers, a message, and we have different groups of farmers, and ideally, I don't remember by heart, but I think it was about 150 farmers per group here. And in this experiment, we then send the message and then afterwards test the response of the farmer and whether or not the message has an influence on their behavior intention. And here we tested the sender of the message, whether it would be a veterinarian, an expert endorser, or a farmer, a peer endorser. So that's the first variable. The second variable we tested is whether we would use a prescriptive or a proscriptive message. So you can have a message that's really direct, stop uninformed worm treatment, or you can have a more indirect message, or a softer message like diagnose before worm treatment. And so there was a 2x2 subject design, peer versus expert, prescriptive versus proscriptive message, and we had 143 farmers involved in this experiment. This is just an example. So it's the same message, No, these are the two different messages. So stop with just uninformed treatment, and here it says make a diagnosis before you treat. And then in this case, it's a veterinarian, and in the other case, the presenter of the message is a peer farmer. And it turned out that the messenger had a significant effect on the farmer's adoption intention. So the veterinarian, which was predicted by our model, had a significant, more positive effect than the farmer. The message itself, how it was formulated, did not have a significant effect. So what can we learn from that? I think the most important thing is that we should involve all the stakeholders, and that was already mentioned by Johannes. It's the multi-actor approach. So the peers are important, although even if the farmers claim that the opinion of their peer farmers has no value to them and they don't care about what their peer farmers think, in reality they do, and they do follow trends. So if you can convince early adopters or opinion leaders within the farmer community, you have a good chance that other farmers will follow their behavior. And then the importance of veterinarians, which can have a positive effect, but can also be used as an excuse for not applying sustainable worm control messages. But this means, in either way, it means that veterinarians should be involved in the decision making. But then, of course, we should know how veterinarians think about and feel about sustainable worm control practices, which we have not investigated yet, because the studies I referred to in Belgium and in Europe were all about farmers. So there's an urgent need now to also investigate the attitudes and the perception of farmers and of veterinarians, and to see how we can influence and motivate veterinarians to apply or to advise sustainable worm control practices. So multi-stakeholder development of sustainable worm control practices will be very important. And then the second important thing is to disrupt routines. You can do that with targeted communication messages or by more subtle behavior change techniques such as nudging. And another thing you can do to disrupt routines is to really plan and make a robust and practical planning of sustainable worm control practices so that the farmer knows what to do when, rather than to give a more general advice, which the farmer will probably not follow because they have their own routines and their own habits that interfere. Johannes already mentioned and explained you the SPARK EU project, so Sustainable Parasite Control in Grazing Ruminants, which is both small and ruminants and cattle all over Europe. And then there's the Cost Action Environs, which is basically about the environmental impact of use of anthelmintics and how we can reduce the environmental impact and the shedding of the excretion of anthelmintic residues by having a more sustainable worm control in place. And in both these projects, so the cost action and the thematic network, again, farmers and veterinarians, in case of environs, also horse owners, and also other stakeholders like farm visitors, will be involved in both quantitative and qualitative research to identify their needs, both the practical needs, but also the factors that influence their decision making. And in those projects, we are trying to fill the gaps that are still there after our studies in COMBAR. So people that are interested to participate in some of the social science research in those projects can always contact the coordinator of Environs, because people can still join the working group on the social sciences there. These are all the people in the COMBAR cost action that contributed to the work that I just presented. I'm not going to read through this slide, but you can download the slides so you can see who already contributed. And I think that's the last slide. Yeah, so these are my contact details in case afterwards people have specific questions. Thank you for your attention.